There we go. Okay. All right. Today I'm with a very good friend of mine, Dr. Scott Miller, who's the founder of the International Center for Clinical Excellence. He's a psychologist, author of several books. Most recent book, he's a co-author on called Better Results: Using Deliberate Practice to Improve Your Therapeutic Effectiveness. And I'm going to tell you, this is an excellent book. I was actually asked to be a reviewer on it, and I gave it, 4 out of 4 stars. I highly encourage everyone to read the book. In my opinion, Scott is one of the, I would say, the top voices in understanding what makes therapy work and just in outcomes in general. So I'm delighted, as always, to see you. Thanks for talking to me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Paul, and it's good to see you too. I always enjoy our chances of just catching up, and whether we're in person with 6 feet distance between us,
yes,
or we're doing this with 1,000 miles between us now.
Yeah. Well, I've been talking and writing a little bit about the importance in creating these kind of magical moments, these transformative experiences. And I mentioned, probably not enough, but the concept of feedback from the client. And I'm just amazed at how how many years has psychotherapy been around? It only just seems like recently in the timeline that we're starting to even pay attention to that. Now, how did you where did the research start, piquing your interest about this feedback phenomena?
Yeah, well, we're a little over 100 years. And during that particular time, outcome research only started in the last, I would say, 50 years in earnest. And that's because Hans Eysenck published this scandalous paper that said that psychotherapy was actually less effective than nothing, than doing nothing. And that paper serves as the impetus, although it's now been shown to have used inappropriate methodologies and been debunked, but it really did serve as the impetus for the field waking up and beginning to look seriously at the effectiveness of psychological treatments. So most therapists that I meet on the road, and most therapists I think throughout the history of the field, believe they ask for and seek feedback. And you can probably recall a session this week, whether it's you, Paul, or me, or somebody who's listening, where you looked at the client and said, so is this okay for you? And that's what's constituted feedback. And if not that, then a more indirect kind of feedback that we're watching and seeing what the impact of our work is. That's what most of us say. But the real serious and scientific look at feedback didn't really start until about the mid-90s. And that happened to be with a very small cohort of researchers that I happened to be connected to. I was the student of Michael J. Lambert. And Michael had invented the OQ45 as an undergraduate, and then partly as a graduate student. I was looking up articles that he was sending us at a time before the internet to the library to pull journals off shelves to look at. So he invented this measurement tool, and he began asking clients to fill this out. Now, why did he do that? That's because he had a professor whose name was Alan Bergen, who was obsessed with client deterioration in psychotherapy. And believe it or not, at that time, we're talking about late 70s, early 80s, there wasn't hardly any research on deleterious effects from psychotherapy. Even though the suicide rate among young analysands in the early days of psychoanalysis, for example, was super high. It was always in the literature. We didn't really have much information about how many people got worse. And Michael was looking for a way to catch that. And his way was simple. As a modern psychologist, skilled in measurement and statistics, he said, well, why don't we ask people in a formal way, are they getting better? And then he created an alert system that went along with that. And really all I did was say the measure that my professor developed and began to validate was awful long for the setting that I worked in. I was working in a setting that was a free clinic. Many of our clients had literacy challenges, and an item, 45 items on a measure that took 20 minutes for many of them, and the others I had to read to. It was just impossible. So we began developing a simpler version of this. We were following on Michael's footsteps, really, and then it just exploded. And of course, feedback is now considered an evidence-based practice. What does that mean, though? It really means that therapists have to use some type of formal measure. You can't depend on yourself. And let me tell you why. Our view, for example, of therapeutic process has a historically low correlation with the client's experience of therapy. So I talk to therapists about this because they say, "Oh, I think my session went well," and I always say, "I don't really care what you think." You know, this is like how a codependent asks about sex. You know, it was good for you. Was it good for me? You know, that's ridiculous. Who cares if the therapist thinks it's good? It's good for them. And this low correlation means we have to actually ask in a formal way. It has to be a structured part of the therapy that we do. And as a result, we've developed two tools. One is the outcome rating scale. It's a very short, brief measure. It's kind of like the stethoscope of mental health practices, not an MRI, just a stethoscope. It's listening to the heartbeat and making sure the client is making progress. And then another scale called the session rating scale, which is an alliance measure or a measure of therapeutic engagement. And I want to give credit where credit is due here, because once more, I had great professors. Lynn Johnson, who offered to allow me as a graduate student to sit behind his mirror. He's a private practitioner and an associate clinical professor at the university that I went to. I was looking for extra experience. He said, "Come sit behind my mirror. Oh, and by the way, I used this little test called the session rating scale." It had, I think, 10 or 15 items at the time. Again, I was thinking, given that I'm working with many clients that struggle with English or with literacy, that we would develop a slightly simpler scale. So one measures engagement, the other measures outcome, and those are an integral part of the clinical work. And when therapists use these on a routine basis, and here's what's also important, they have to integrate the feedback into their care. So it's not enough to weigh yourself, right? You also have to act on the measurement that you get. You know, are you in the right weight area, or do you need to exercise a bit more, cut calories a bit more? It's the same thing here. So you're going to have to ask the clients for feedback in a formal way, and then integrate it into the care to alter the care, to better engage them, or to change the direction of therapy when progress isn't forthcoming. Wow, that was a long exegesis there. I hope I just didn't make you all unconscious.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is a common question I know you've gotten and I've heard you get at conferences is why are people so hesitant to actively do this? And again, if anyone just looks up and they go to your website to see, you know, to get, you know, info on these measurements, and they're really simple to implement, you know, at the end of a session. I mean, but why do some therapists that, "Oh, I don't know about that"? I mean, what did you found in your kind of work?
Well, you know, I have a couple of thoughts. First off, I'm shocked by the number of people who download the scales from my website. They're free, by the way. You can get them there for free in about 30 different languages. So I think that there are many therapists who in fact are using measures, and you can use mine or you can use somebody else's. I don't really care. I think there are many who are using the scales that you just don't hear about. They're not tooting their horn or waving their flag, so to speak. What we do hear are people who are bothered by it and annoyed by it at conferences that don't seem to want to. And for part of me, I see this very naturalistically. We still have problems with hand washing. Okay, that's 200 years after Semmelweis. So I figure that something like measurement is just naturalistically going to take a while. And why don't people wash their hands? They think they know their hands are clean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So why don't people ask for feedback? They think they know. They think they know. So, you know, psychologically, I think those are the two main reasons. There's a very small group who have some theoretical objection to the tools, but once those folks see them in operation, the way they're used, and really the important thing about integrating them into the work, then I think it's then I think the resistance is much less, actually, Paul. It, it, I think I don't know if I can say this, when a physician uses a stethoscope, they don't walk in and go, point at it and go, geez, management is making us do this now. Oh, my professor said I got to do this dumb thing. The physician does it, and they don't think of it as, let me do this and get it out of the way so I can do the real medical treatment. The stethoscope is the medical treatment. It's part of it. The whole thing fits together. So measurement for me and the feedback that it allows is part of the entire treatment experience that I have. And so in workshops, when people say, that they have a theoretical objection or I'm not so sure, I usually say, have you tried it?
Mm-hmm.
Can I talk you into downloading the scales at least and asking your clients? Second thing I say is, who can really do something without some kind of instruction or support? So there's a whole community of people that are doing this, associated with what's called the International Center for Clinical Excellence. And literally hundreds of thousands of therapists around the world who are meeting on that site and sharing their experience. So get some support as well. And then I think you'll probably find that the data that you get is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm even surprised at the number of therapists who don't even ask. It's like while they're in the session, it's like I can't go through a session without bouncing and having things come back. And even just at the end to say, what was this session like for you? I mean, even to ask. Now, I found that when you give them the paper and they do it, sometimes you'll get more. It's almost like a safety. If I write it down, if I on a scale of 1 to 5, it was kind of a 3.
Yeah.
It's like to tell you, oh, well, you're great. But inside they're like, I didn't feel heard. But it's like a lot of folks, again, hopefully the minority, just aren't even checking in.
Yeah.
And then I guess to go from, hey, you're not even checking in to here's a form, I can see how that can be a jump for them. But I'm just like, I don't want to say shocked, but in a way I am that, and then they think that they know, because crying out loud, how often in therapy, particularly if you ever work with couples, you swear you know reality and the other partner swears he or she knows reality. So why would you as the therapist think that you know reality, what they're really thinking, how the session's going?
Well, and so this may be a good place to insert the empirical motivation for seeking feedback. Here's the reality. In general, in the United States, 25% of people who start in treatment end before they have experienced a reliable improvement in their well-being. So 25%. So 1/4 of our clients decide, I'd rather be mentally ill than be forced to meet with you one more time. That's kind of a bad sign. So that's the first tick in the box. The second tick is that when a client goes to see a therapist, knowing nothing else about the pair, there's a 50-50 shot that client ends up with a reliable improvement. So first you got 25% who disappear. Then of the people who stay, half are going to be successful. The other half are not. And between 20 and 30% of those are going to stay in the treatment and experience no benefit. But they'll stay, they'll keep coming. So these things should motivate us, I would think, because when I meet therapists, and it's really why I've stayed in this business for so long, I really love therapists. And the reason is, my experience is they are mostly 99% genuinely caring human beings, and they want to do right by their clients. That is my experience. Of course, there's always a jerk somewhere. No, not at all. There's always somebody who doesn't really care about their work, is burned out, who's an evil person who really doesn't like people, but somehow ended up in the business. But most of them are really kind-hearted people. So given that, the data should push us to begin using something to keep people in treatment, to change treatment for those that it's not helping, and to catch those who are sticking around and it's not helping, so that we can do something different. And when therapists are alerted, again, I've found that they're not helping, they try harder. They try harder, most of them. So it's not a very difficult process to download the skills and begin integrating them into work and to facilitate a discussion. And I think it helps most therapists live up to their ideal self, to the reason why that they entered the profession in the first place. Let me say one other thing. When clients walk in the door, they're the wild card of therapy. You know, if they were all the same, all had the same problems, but even the ones who have the same problems, what's different about them is usually greater than what's same about them because of the problem that they have. So they are the true wild card. Well, that experience as a therapist is actually matched by the data. So let me give you a figure. 87% of the variance in treatment outcome is attributable to the client and what they have when they walk through the door. It's the lion's share. So if we're not able to tap that, if we're not able to engage that, if we're not able to respond to those individual client differences, then our outcomes are necessarily going to be more narrow, and our dropout rates and disengagement rates are going to be higher. So all of these are like the empirical case for why not integrate this into part of your care in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, some people who come from a maybe a more I'll just call it a right brain approach to therapy. And, you know, I'm real big on improvisation and kind of social construction, or somebody from art therapy, you know, who have this kind of, just real briefly, can you speak to those who may be watching that works, the feedback measurement works in those scenarios with those kind of theoretical orientations?
Well,
as
you know,
well?
I really dislike those people. You know, those artistic, intuitive types, I really dislike them because I am a plodder. And so when they jump ahead and they have these marvelous insights and can come up with these creative exercises that they do, and then they get the client down on their painting, I think, oh, geez, all I have are my words. You know, just use your words, Scott, because that's the only skill you have. But so, you know, but what do those people do? I think it's unfair to characterize those types of clinicians who, again, I love and I'm amazed by, as simply so disorganized that they can't incorporate the measures into their work. So I'll bet most of those people have an appointment book. And the reason they have an appointment book is because that's where the art ends.
Yeah.
That's where the intuition, well, I think I have an appointment with Bob today. No, they don't do that. Instead, they have an appointment book. And right there in the appointment book, as they open it up to look, it should say, administer the outcome scale at the beginning of this visit and the SRS at the end. And what was it?
Uh-huh.
So that they're still the book. And I'll bet they don't forget to ask for the check at the end of the session. Right?
Yeah.
That's not art. You know, what is money anyway, really? What is money? You know, it's just, it has no meaning. It's just abstract. You know, there's some things that aren't so abstract and intuitive.
Uh-huh.
So of course, folks can do that. And we have lots of folks that, again, that I truly envy their amazing intuitive skills. I think, to be honest, Paul, you're one of those people that has this very intuitive, some of the times when we've had conversations, you say, well, you know, I just did X, Y, and Z. And I'm thinking, what? Where did that come from? I'm still back here. Use my words. So, you know, but you have this exceptionally creative and far-reaching ability to connect with people in a variety of ways other than with language. So, yeah, of course you can use. Of course you can use it. Is it going to be different? Yes, but again, you pay your mortgage. You know, you make your appointments. You get to check at the end of the session.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is very similar. Just part of the ritual.
Well, and it can definitely be part of the ritual, you know, and the client, after the first or second time, they come to expect it. Like if I get caught up and I forget at the end, you know, okay, so I've got you down for next week, and they go, you going to give me the sheet? So oh yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And having a reminder, I love that. And the clients, I think many of them, you know, to be fair, every once in a while, a client will say, no, I don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people who've started using them will come to me and say, you know, I tried to get the client to do this, but they said no. I said, and I'll usually say, did you say client or clients?
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, client, I gave it to them and they didn't want to do it. Well, you know, who wants to do what person wants to do everything? Of course,
Right.
there's going to be somebody. Is
Right.
there anything to learn here? I don't know. Let's talk a little bit more about this. Generally, what I find in the very beginning is that people don't spend enough time integrating the measures into their work and creating a culture of feedback with their client. If the physician just took their stethoscope and ripped your top off and stuck it on your chest, it probably would cause a reaction in a lot of people.
Mhm.
But they don't do that. Oftentimes what they do is they say, I'd like to listen to your lungs and your heart, and the reason we're doing this is X, Y, and Z, and that will tell me what treatment we can do next. They explain it. They may even heat it up before they put it on your chest.
Mhm.
All of this is creating a culture that invites mutuality
Mhm.
and participation and engagement.
Right. And that co-creation of a session, as a big chunk of your work
Hmm.
has been on, this has got really nothing to do about just the client or just the therapist.
No.
It is that kind of co-creative, a book you co-authored called The Heroic Client, to me
Yeah.
was one of the first books that it's kind of like, hey, enough about you. What's the clients doing?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think it's Bohart and Tallman who talked about it's all self-healing.
Yeah.
So why are we not paying more attention to the client? Who's the
Yeah.
one who's doing the self-healing?
That's right. Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Well, I got you for a few minutes, and I wanted to ask you before we go, how can we wrap this idea of feedback in with this other thing that I mentioned earlier, deliberate practice? And if
Mm.
you got a minute,
Yeah.
I think this is the big shift, because I'm not going to take your thunder away, but when I read the research and all of this, finally I feel we have something
Yeah.
that actually shows a change in outcomes
Yeah. Yeah.
that we can do. So could you
Yeah.
talk about how to incorporate feedback, but along with deliberate practice?
Oh, okay. And let me just give you. I hope this isn't too boring. Just kind of the steps that have moved at least me to deliberate practice. I started like most therapists in graduate school. I finished, and I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing.
Mhm.
So I started to go to trainings, and I learned a, a, a specific model of doing therapy, and I learned it very well. I actually went to work with the people who invented that approach,
Mhm.
and I was there for 5 years. I could do it in my sleep backwards and forwards, and I felt very confident. The problem was when we had some researchers come in and evaluate, it didn't make me any more effective than I'd been before. It didn't make anyone more effective than I'd been
Mhm.
before. So we threw it away. I left, and we began looking for what accounted for the effectiveness of therapy, because that's what I wanted to know. What could I do to be a better therapist? That's been the ambition. And as I say, I'm not a natural at this. I really struggle with being in a room with a person who's suffering. I don't intuit things. So we worked real hard to identify what the factors were that seemed to be associated with effective therapy. Problem with it is knowing those factors didn't make us more effective. So then we decided, well, to hell with all of that. We'll just measure. And at least then we'll know whether we're effective or not with that person.
Right.
So we started to do that. And then pretty soon, as we did it with thousands and thousands of therapists, we discovered some were better than others
Mhm.
consistently and with whomever they work. Now let that sink in. So first we learned techniques, didn't make a bit of difference. Then we begin to measure, we find out some are more effective than others. That leads to the question, well, what the heck are they doing?
Right.
And believe it or not, our field's been down this road several times. David F. Ricks back in 1974
Mhm.
pointed out that certain therapists were more effective than others. He called them super shrinks, but he had no idea how they got that way. Michael Lambert did a quantitative study about this in 2010. His conclusion was, yep, there they are. We don't have any idea how they do it. So our team really struggled because we were now measuring. We had tens of thousands of clients in our database, and some were reliably more effective than others. And let me tell you, they weren't just a smidgen more effective. They were a full standard deviation more effective than other therapists. So we're talking about over the course of a lifetime, helping hundreds and hundreds more people live better, more fulfilling, happier lives. We wanted to know what it was. How did they do it? And I think we'd still be struggling had we not stumbled upon the work of another psychologist, a Swedish psychologist. His name is Anders Ericsson, who, interestingly enough, in fields far from psychotherapy have been asking the question, why are some chess players better than others? Why are some pole vaulters better than others? Why are some swimmers faster than others? His research indicated that they spent more time in an activity called deliberate practice. That is focused attention at the margins of your performance. Now, I think this just makes sense. You have to find where your abilities and skills break down, and then practice things that have leverage on improving your outcome. We did a study and we found that better performing therapists spent 2.5 times more time in deliberate practice than average therapists. So we all deliberately practice to some degree. It's just that the top therapists do it more. And again, they're much better at finding the edge of their performance, seeking out resources and coaches that can help them develop exercises that work those weak therapeutic muscles. And the measures can help in this respect. So this comes now full circle. Because if you begin measuring your outcomes, you can dice and slice that data and look for when you don't do as well as you usually do. Maybe it's with kids. Maybe it's with teenagers. Maybe it's with women or men or trans clients. Maybe it's with clients from one cultural group versus another, or one particular clinical issue or another. Having the data at my fingertips allows me to identify those weak areas and then work at the edges to improve my performance. That's deliberate practice. That's what we talk about in the new book, Better Results, where we've laid out how to measure your results, and then how to identify those areas, and then how to set up exercises that help you work the muscles, those weaker muscles in those particular areas.
Our mutual friend, Richard Hill, who I've recently interviewed, who was previously an actor, he made the comment that he can't imagine his previous profession of acting without deliberate practice. And when you're going on about this, and he said it just seemed odd to him why this was for therapy, this would not already be something that was, we've known about this for 100 years.
Yeah. Well, I think he has a point. I also think that our field has focused their practice efforts in the wrong area. Now, I have a friend, part of the interesting part of my job as a researcher has been to look for analogs for the kinds of skills we're trying to teach therapists how to do. So when we first started studying deliberate practice, I reached out to some top performers in the different fields. One of them was a guy named Michael Amar, who is, I can't remember how many times he's been a FISM champion, as the magician of the year. And Michael is a really amazing guy. One of the first things he told me was, practice does not make perfect. It makes permanent. So you better be careful about what you practice. Otherwise, you end up with a training scar rather than going far by your training. And what have we practiced as a field? Models and techniques. You can see therapists lined up the door for the latest new model and technique. Why do we do that? Well, clearly in our hearts, we want to be better. That's what I said earlier. The problem is that models and techniques may not be your weak area. You think it may be. That's your self-assessment. I'm not going to trust your assessment. I want to look at your data. And I'll tell you what we find in terms of therapist weak spots. And it's going to be shocking because we train it the least. And that's empathy. So you therapists can work wonders and circles around others with regard to their techniques, whether it's touching or tapping or confronting your dysfunctional thoughts or creating a thought log, whatever it is. We got techniques up the wazoo. All of those things have very little leverage on outcome. Let me say it again. All of those things have very little leverage on outcome, and they're going to have zero if that's not a weakness for you. So why would you practice that? Instead, you got to find out where your weak spots are, as I said. But if you know nothing about where your weak spots are, I'll tell you where we find therapists always fall short. And that is in being able to respond empathically across all client presentations. And let me drill down and get more specific. Most therapists are great with an anxious client or a depressed client. You know, their empathy levels are off the chart. You just want to sit in there if you're depressed and just be loved all up.
Mm-hmm.
Give you an angry client.
Mm-hmm.
And not a client who's like angry at the world. I'm talking about pissed off at you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therapist empathy levels drop down to the high school level.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're either deer in the headlights or they're responding with things like, so you're feeling very angry. You know, it's just poor levels, and that's a skill that can be worked. Now, should you go work at that right now? No, that's not what I'm advocating. I'm just speaking generalities here based on what we've seen when we've been helping individual therapists create deliberate practice plans. So the key is to find out where your weak spots are. And I'll give you one more clue. If you go to my website and download the measures and begin measuring, you're going to aggregate that data. And then you can use a document that's in the measures file called the Taxonomy of Deliberate Practice Activities. And that taxonomy will help you organize your weaknesses into areas that have leverage on outcome. And then it will help you narrow down to one specific goal. It could be relationship, it could be reflectiveness, it could be responsiveness, it could be structure and focus of the therapy, it could be creating hope and expectancy, a whole host of factors that we know have an impact on the outcome of the therapy that we do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what you're doing now is so I kind of feel like you're I don't say you found it, but it's like I think you got the direction, the research that you guys are doing, I think is really moving into a much needed arena. I don't think I ever told you this, but years and years ago, I heard you speak. It might have been at Evolution or one of those big conferences. I sat in the back, and it was back when you were talking about the common factors, and I left that and I was like, I don't like that guy. I think he's full of crap. And then I happened to come across a quote. I was reading something that night from the science fiction author Robert Anton Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
And the quote was, "Belief is the death of intelligence." And it just hit me. And it's like, I'm going to go look at that guy's death. So I started looking at not just your work, but also the wonderful Bruce Wampold. I mean,
Yeah.
stuff as well. And I have to say, I've had to accept that I had a belief that was limiting my therapeutic intelligence. So I'm really glad that you guys are continuing to kind of move forward with this, because for me, I think deliberate practice is very exciting. And it also can be fun. I want you, before we wrap it up, you actually have trainings where you talk a lot about the feedback and the deliberate practice. Can you talk a little bit about some basic ways that you're training people, and also go ahead and let people know where they can find out about your information, website, and all that?
Yeah, and in all of the information that I've been talking about here, you can find in the new book, Better Results. You can also find it on my personal website, which is at scottdmiller.com. D as in David, scottdmiller.com. And we do offer a number of intensive trainings throughout the year, usually in spring and in summer. Now, this particular summer, we won't be offering them in Chicago for face-to-face. Things are so disrupted. But we are going to have a deliberate practice asynchronous course starting in September, and we'll be announcing that shortly. And it's made for the ages, meaning that information is sent to you at your pace in the form of very short videos with work that you do in between. You do it at your own pace, and then we come on and consult with you throughout that to make sure that your individualized development plan is optimized. And this process can take 2 months. It could take a year if you want it to unfold at that particular pace. But I think my website is the best place. And even if you're skeptical about this, because deliberate practice has to be viewed as a marathon, not a sprint. So you wouldn't go to a weekend workshop hoping to become fluent in Spanish. or another language you were trying to learn. You know that you can learn some phrases, very useful phrases, in 2 days, and so, but you're not really speaking the language. You've memorized some stock phrases. The words don't have meaning. That's like deliberate practice. Secondly, chances are, if you've been in the field for a while, your outcomes are good. So going from good to better takes a lot more effort than going from no skills to good.
Mhm.
Let me say it again. Going from good to better takes a lot more effort than going from no skills as a therapist to good outcomes as a therapist. That takes very little effort. So be prepared for the long haul. It's going to take time. It's more of a marathon. And be patient with yourself. You're going to be accomplishing very small things, but those over time have a profound impact. How do we know? We have a study about it. It's really the only study in the history of the field so far, and this will be hard to believe, that shows improvement in outcome at the individual therapist level.
Mhm.
You would think training in CBT or IPT or EMDR or whatever would improve your outcomes. I defy you to show me a study that indicates that.
Mhm.
What we have is a study that shows that when you use feedback, when you engage in deliberate practice, slowly but surely your individual outcomes move up.
Awesome. Listen, I really appreciate you taking time out of your very, very busy schedule because this is probably, we're in the midst of this COVID stuff. This is the most time I think you've had at home in 40 years because this guy is in the air all the time, flying all over the world. So I'm glad at least we could do this.
Oh, I appreciate this opportunity, Paul.
All right. Thank you, my friend.